Well, have you been enjoying the Faithful series so far? It has been so good. We've had 2 weeks already on the go. First week we talked about Job. Last week we talked about Esther. And this week we're going to be talking about Gideon. So just to give you a little bit of a background of who Gideon is. His story is found in the book of Judges, chapter 6 and 7 mostly. Gideon was a young farmer who farmed in Israel. His family wasn't wealthy by any means. They were just an average farming family. And Gideon lived in Israel at a time when the nation of Israel actually turned their backs on God, and they were actually going in an opposite direction to what God's plan was for them, to what God wanted for them. So we're going to dive right into the text, and we're going to walk through the story of Gideon. And as we do, there's going to be all sorts of things that we're going to pull out that God, I believe, is saying to us as a church, as he was saying at the time when it was written, because there's a lot of things that we can learn. So we're just going to dive right in and get right to it. So here we are in Judges chapter 6, starting right at the beginning. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So again, here we see the nation of Israel decided that they were going to go in a different direction than what God would have had them go. And when that happened, there were some natural consequences that began to take place. And we see that God gave them into the hands of the Midianites. He allowed them to come in. And so verse 2, because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land and ravaged it. Midian was so impoverished, the Israelites, that they cried out to the Lord for help. So here's what's going on in this situation. You've got the nation of Israel, Gideon, one of the farmers, and all the other farmers. They would prepare their fields. They would sow their fields, and they'd water them, and they'd tend to them, and they'd take care of them, and they'd give, the little ewes would give birth to the little lambs, and you'd have the cattle, and you've had all their farming and all their agriculture that was taking place, and they would prepare it and take care of it. And when harvest time came, what would happen is these neighboring groups called the Midianites, they would come in and they would absolutely steal and destroy everything that Israel had been working on. They'd steal their crops, they'd steal their livestock, and whatever they didn't steal, they'd kill and destroy. And we see this didn't just happen once, but this began as a pattern. It happened over and 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 over again. And they were terrified, and so we see that they would hide in the mountains, and they'd hide in caves, and they would collect whatever little bit that they could to maybe help them survive through the next several months until the next crop came, and the whole thing happened again. And so this was the pattern, and it's interesting because we see in verse 6, it says this: Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. They became so impoverished that they cried out to the Lord for help. I find it interesting that it took them hitting absolute rock bottom before they cried out to God for help. You see, I think for many of us, that's what we tend to wait for. We tend to cry out to God when we have no other option, when we've exhausted everything within our power, every option, every method of solving it, everything else didn't work, and so our last resort is that we call out to God, that we seek him. There's a tragedy or there's a diagnosis. Maybe we're in the deep clutches of addiction. Life has become absolutely unmanageable. We're at the brink of bankruptcy, and it's at this point that many of us say something like this: God, if you would get me out of this situation, I'll go to church. God, if you would just help me in here and fix this, then I'll serve you. I'll stop doing that thing and I'll start doing the other thing. See, it's funny how that's just human nature, isn't it? We wait till we get rock bottom where there's no other options, and then we say, well, maybe there's something God can do. You see, prayer, calling out to God, should always be our first response, not our last resort. Let me say that again. Prayer, calling out to God, should always be our first response, not our last resort. And so we see God respond here to the cries of the Israelites. It says, when the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. But you have not listened to me. God gave them a way forward. He said, I want you to walk in obedience with me. I want you to walk closely with me because I will have a plan for you, and it's a good plan for you. But instead, they didn't listen. They didn't like his answer. How often is that us? We don't like God's plan. We don't like God's answer. But here's the interesting thing about this. I am so grateful that God is patient. Amen? He is so patient. And although the people of Israel turned their back on God, God didn't give up on them. And that's something I think that there's some people that need to hear that today. I want you to know this. God has not given up on you. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what circumstances you've done, what horrible things that you've done. It doesn't matter how many times that you've turned your back on God. God has not given up on you. It doesn't matter if people around you have given up on you, or some of you even here in this room, some of you even watching online right now, you have given up on yourself. But you need to know, God has not given up on you. Let me say that again. God has not given up on you. And so we see here that God also did not give up on the people of Israel, even though they had turned their back on him. And we continue along here in verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak tree in Orpha that belonged to Joash, the Abarite, whose son was Gideon. And Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress. So here we see God hears the voice, God hears the cry out from Israel, and he sends an angel of the Lord to this guy, Gideon, threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but it's like that, we have no context of what that actually means. So let me just give you kind of a breakdown of what that looks like. So threshing wheat. So threshing wheat was this process, and there's going to be a picture pop up on the screen, so it gives you a little bit of an idea. This is kind of a biblical era threshing floor. And so generally it was up in a higher place, maybe on the top of a hill. It was open to the air, and what would happen was they would harvest all the wheat, they'd put it into the threshing floor, they would beat it and move it around and mix it and all these sorts of things, and then they would take it and they would throw it in the air. And what would happen was the wind would come and it would catch the chaff or the bits that were, not important. You couldn't use them anyway. And so they would kind of blow it away. And what you were left with was the usable wheat that would be left on the threshing floor. And so this is how you would thresh the wheat. Get the wheat, you make the flour, you get the bread, all those sorts of things. That would happen. And so this is the way that you would do it up on a high place. But here we see Gideon is not threshing wheat on a threshing floor. He's threshing wheat in a wine press. Here's a picture of a wine press. It's the opposite of a threshing floor. It's actually underground. It's actually a pit underground that you would put the grapes in there and they would stomp them and they would all this thing and they get all the grape just out of it and they would make the wine. So here is Gideon threshing wheat, not above ground where the wind can do it where it works the best, but he's actually doing it in a pit and he's hiding. He's hiding from them. And the reason why he's hiding is because he's so terrified of the Midianites. He says, if I can thresh the wheat in the wine press and maybe there's a little bit that I can get for my family and maybe we can just survive a little bit. And so here the angel of the Lord has found Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press. And it goes on in verse 12 and he says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. I don't know if you caught that. Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press because he's terrified. And the Lord says, mighty warrior. Here's something interesting about this. See, when God calls us, when God speaks to us, he calls us how he created us. He calls us how he created us. We can have our own perspective of who we are. We can have our own idea of who we are as a person, or what our makeup is, what our identity is, what our passions are, what our gifts, abilities are. We can have all those things, but God will always call us up to how he created us. He's not going to reinforce our own perspectives of who we are. He's going to call us how he made us. That's how he's going to speak to us. And so to Gideon, to himself, he was a small, scared little man. Gideon to himself was not a mighty warrior. He was a spineless weakling. He was cowering away from the enemies. He wasn't facing them down. He was running away from the front lines. He wasn't running towards the fight. But God created him. And so he knew who he really was. And so God called out of him what he put into him. He called him a mighty warrior. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? So God told him, go in the strength that you have. What strength does he have? What strength does he have? Gideon's afraid. He's chicken. He's got no strength. Here he is alone on the threshing floor, threshing wheat. He has no strength. But when the angel of the Lord spoke to him, and declared that he would be the one to free Israel from their oppressors, Gideon began to argue. Gideon says, but Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Notice Gideon's response to God. It was all focused on himself. It was all focused on what his perspective of himself was, not on what God created him to do. Have you ever felt that way before? You ever felt that way that what God has asked you to do, that you're just like, there's no way that I could possibly do this? You're not alone, because Gideon, we see, felt the same way. This seems to be a pattern in our lives and even a pattern in Scripture, in the Bible. But in each case, God's response is the same. Listen, God knew your weaknesses before he called you. He knew Gideon's weaknesses before he called Gideon. That's why his answer to Gideon is the same as his answer to you today. In verse 16, the Lord answered and said, I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites together. Moses had the same excuse. What's God's response to Moses? Certainly, I'll be with you. To Jeremiah, God said, do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you. To Jacob, who was alone in the desert, fleeing for his life from his brother who wanted to kill him, God said, I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. To Joshua, who took over from the legendary Moses, God said, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Why? For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. To the disciples, in Matthew 28, Jesus said, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And to you, God says, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. You see, little is much when God is in it. Little is much when God is in it. God's promise to Gideon is God's promise to you. Whatever circumstances that you find yourself in, God says, I'm with you. Don't be discouraged. Don't be depressed. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. And I am for you, and it doesn't matter what comes against you. I will be with you, and I'm never going to leave you. That's God's promise. This should bring us comfort this morning. This should bring us confidence this morning. And so after confirming with God, a back and forth, Gideon decides that he's going to say yes to God's call with the little that he has. And so we see that Gideon now has to put this army together. So Gideon puts out a call for all the fighting men in Israel to meet him, to assemble the army. And here's the crazy thing about it. Essentially, he's putting out a little bit of a help wanted ad. You know, like I could see if it was in modern days, he put out an X. Or he'd put out a, ad in the newspaper. And it would look something like this. Looking for men willing to fight for their freedom against an army that's larger and stronger than us. Boy, that bodes confidence, doesn't it? But here's the amazing thing about it. Guess what? Men respond. In fact, 32,000 men respond. They're like, yep, pick me, I'll come. So here's Gideon. He puts out this ad, and all of a sudden 32,000 men come out of the woodworks, and they say, count me in. I'm into it. And I can imagine that at this moment, Gideon's looking at these 32,000 men as they're beating, and they're going, man, this might actually work. I mean, sure, we're outnumbered 1-4 still, but there's a chance. When God asks us to do something, to take a step of faith, he has already been working in the background, preparing what we cannot see. God called Gideon and said, Gideon, you don't have very much, but I want to use what you do have. And so Gideon says, okay, anybody want to fight? God's already been working, 32,000 men show up. We can trust that. But Judges chapter 7, verse 2, this is where the story begins to get really interesting. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into your hands. What? You have too many men. I read that right? You have too many men for me to deliver. When do you have too many men? Okay, I can get it. You're in a 50-man lifeboat and you have 60 people. That's too many men. But here's what it's like. It's what God is saying to Gideon. He's like saying, hey, you have too much money to get through this financial crisis. You got way too much food to get through this famine. It makes no sense. Why would God say that? Why would God communicate that? He just told Gideon sent out 32,000 men, and God said, nah, it's too many people. That makes no sense. But here's what God says. He says this, in order that Israel may not boast against me, that her strength has saved her. Announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left. He started with nothing. Then there was 32,000. God said too many. He said, okay, if you're scared, you can leave. 22,000 say, never mind, I'm scared. And Gideon's left with 10,000, only 10,000 people. I'm getting nervous just thinking about what he's probably feeling. So hopefully now at this point, God is done with this nonsensical orders and he's ready to send Gideon's army out to fight. Wrong. The Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. This isn't going well for Gideon, y'all. God says, take him down to the water. And so the Lord told him, separate those who lap water with their tongues like dogs from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. All the other men let go to his own place. Gideon must be having a nervous breakdown right now. 32,000 to 10,000 to 300, and the 300 that are left, the only reason why they're there is because they drank water the right way. What? Here's just a little visual of what that might look like. You know how when you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like you do the ticks? So this is 32,000 ticks. And at the very bottom, you'll see some red ones there. There's the 300. This is what Gideon went to. It's crazy. It's insane. So Gideon will be freaking out because this massive army has to fight, and he's thinking there's no way that we can do this. You see, often God doesn't make sense to us. And we say, God, this enemy is just too big. You've gone to the doctors, and you had some tests done, and you're not expecting it, but the doctor comes into you and he says, you have cancer. And you're like, this enemy is too big. This disease is too big. There's no way that I can overcome it. This is just too big. I can't do this. There's no way that I'm going to make it through this. Or maybe you've got a child who walked away from you or walked away from the Lord, and they're living a life that just breaks your heart. And every night you cry yourself to sleep and you go, God, the enemy's got too much of a hold on my kid. There's no way. They're too far gone. There's no way. This enemy's too big. That's not going to work out. Or you're sitting there and your marriage is on the rocks and you're just moments away and it feels like there's no hope. There's been too much pain. There's been too much anguish. There's been too much betrayal. There's been too much go on, and you feel there's just no way that you'll see victory in this family. Look, you look at your circumstances and you're convinced that there's no hope. I'm going to ask you today, what circumstances are you looking at and feeling like there's no hope? Where in your life are you going, there's no way that this can work out? You've convinced that the enemy is just too big. The problem is just too tough. The situation is just too bleak. But God demonstrates something to Gideon that we can learn from this. It says, when you say your enemy is too big, God says, I am bigger. He says, I am bigger. So you don't have to deny the power of the enemy. That's not what I'm saying. Satan is sly, he's cunning, and in this world, he's powerful. There's things that he can do. But 1 John 4:4 says this, greater is the one who is in you than the one who is in the world. Little is much when God is in it. Your enemies may rise up against you, but Romans 8:31 says this, what then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? Little is much when God is in it. God is bigger than the sickness that you're facing. God is bigger than the financial crisis that you're facing. God is bigger than the family pressure and the family situation and issues you're facing. God is bigger than the addiction that you're staring down right now. Your enemy is big, no doubt about it. But God says, I am bigger. His power is greater than anything that you'll face. You see, listen to this. Faith does not deny reality. Faith recognizes God's sovereignty in the reality. Faith does not deny reality. Faith doesn't say what's going on isn't happening. It doesn't say it doesn't hurt. It doesn't say I'm scared. Faith recognizes the sovereignty of God in the reality that you're facing. We have to remember that. Little is much when God is in it. So the little that you have, the little faith that you have, the little trust that you have, you give it to God. And he says, I'll do something with that. Little is much. So the story continues of Gideon. During the night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp because I'm going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they're saying. Afterwards, you'll be encouraged to attack the camp. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling his friend a dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, well, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Weird. Anybody else find a dream about bread weird? Like, it's a little odd, I have to admit. So let's just talk about this for a quick second. I'm so glad that I wasn't the guy that was interpreting the dream. Because had that dream been given to me, hey, I had this dream about this loaf of bread and blah, 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 blah. What do you think it means? It says, I think it means that you're not supposed to be a soldier. I think it means that you're supposed to be a baker. I mean, you are kind of a crusty guy. No, but seriously, this is the yeast of their worries. This is a loaf and death situation that they're facing here. Okay, I better stop loafing around here or we're all going to be toast. Okay, where's the butter? I'm on a roll. All right, sorry, last crummy joke. Nevertheless, God used the Midianites and this wacky bread dream to encourage Gideon because look at what happened. When Gideon, this is like if there was like a movie score or something like that was in the background with the violins and the army running in slow motion, this is what this would be, okay? So just picture that in your head. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up! The Lord has given Midian camp into our hands. So it's time to prepare for battle. And here's God's plan for them. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars into their hands of all of them, with torches inside. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Once again, God's plan is crazy. This doesn't sound like a strategy that's going to work. I'm just going to say it. Candles and jars? This is the Bed Bath & Body Works plan of military operations over here. I can just see it. We're going to attack them with our candles. We're going to relax them to death. This makes no sense, but whatever. It's time for battle. So we pick up in Judges chapter 7, verse 19. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp and at the beginning of the middle of watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke their jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding their right hands with the trumpets that they were to blow. They shouted, a sword of the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords, and the army fled. Wow. This is unbelievable. It worked. I can't believe it. In spite of all that was against them, in spite of all the human logic that didn't make any sense, God's plan worked. See, when God leads, you succeed. When God leads, you succeed. That is what we can see. And because Gideon gave the little bit that he had, the little bit of faith, the little bit of trust that he had, the Israelite army won. And if you keep reading, you'll see that this was a decisive victory and that peace reigned in Israel again. God's plan made no sense, but it worked. God asked Gideon to do some things that made absolutely no sense with the little bit that he had. Asking a weak little scared farmer to lead an army. Little is much when God is in it. Telling the farmer that he had too many men to win the battle. Little is much when God is in it. instructing Gideon to trim down the army by the style of their drinking water. Little is much when God is in it. Using a dream of a loaf of bread to encourage Gideon. Little is much when God is in it. Instructing Gideon to use jars, lamps, and trumpets to defeat an army. Little is much when God is in it. You see, if there's one thing that we can learn from Gideon's story, it teaches us that if we give God the little bit that we have, he can do much with it. You might feel weak, but God says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. Little is much when God is in it.